Hello and welcome back to my bookish channel. It's Friday, at the end of this quite rainy week. I've got a pile of paperbacks to go through. These are vintage paperbacks that have been with me just about all my life. After a few days of talking about brand new books, I thought I'd bring out the really old ones. These are, some of them are tie-ins, actually. Others are science fiction fantasy that I've picked up almost at random over the years and then decided that would stay with me forever. Okay, the V series from the early 80s, beginning with V, and this was the first sequel, East Coast Crisis, which was the alien invasion story as seen from the point of view of New York City, because the TV show and the first book was about LA, as far as I remember. Really great. Howard Weinstein and A.C. Crispin. Now, A.C. Crispin was a writer who died a few years ago, and she was on Facebook, and I couldn't believe she actually was there as a real person, because I'd read her books over the years. I'd read her tie-ins for Star Wars, the great Han Solo trilogy that she wrote about his youth, and her Star Trek books, especially the ones to do with Spock's hidden, forgotten son. Everything she did I really liked. I loved her own science fiction series, which was called, I'm looking for it now, Starbridge, of course. The ones I've read of that, it's really hard to get hold of. It was a kind of Star Wars, Star Trek hybrid in some ways. That's probably doing it a disservice. It was space opera. Anyway, V, the series, is really worth looking up, if they're still around, still available. Battlestar Galactica from the original show. I read this book when I was 8 years old. Glenn A. Larson and Robert Thurston. It took me about 30 years to realise that they'd novelised almost everything in the original Battlestar Galactica. I loved the first book, and the movie made the first few episodes so much. I never quite got on with the remake series, but I didn't give it enough attention, really. It was science fiction in big letters. This was kind of disco science fiction of the late 70s, and that's an era of stuff that I really enjoy. The bit where the escaping humans find a planet where they can go gambling and drinking, and then they all get eaten by giant insect people, is amazing. Queen of Sorcery, the second volume of the Belgariad. I've talked about these recently, David Eddings' series. This is this paperback, Falling to Pieces, is one that I bought in America at some point when I was on a reread of the series in about 2008 or something. And this second one, I remembered, is the one I love most of all. It's the one where they go into the swamp world, and the lead character's powers are tested to the limit, and he goes to war. He starts fighting a kind of a horrible snake god at one point. It's really vivid and very lurid and phantasmagorical. It's a lovely series that all turned to shit for the sequel. They did 5 books in this series, and then the Mandalorian, which was a kind of lap of honour around the same old places 20 years later. And I read the first book in The Mandalorian when I went to university, and I was so disappointed, and I thought in recent years I'll try it again to see if it was, maybe it was just me, I'd changed, and maybe it's time I went back to that world. And it was still awful. It was bigger scale, it was battles, endless battles, wars, nowhere near as good as the original 5 books. Here's a piece of comic fantasy that I've adored for years and years. John DeClay's The Party-Coloured Unicorn. Now, you see, it came from that shop in Darlington that sold remaindered science fiction and fantasy. So it's got the little clip on the corner and the 70p price label. And then, like lots of these books published by Ace Fantasy and Del Rey of the time in the 80s, these peculiar photorealistic covers that I just love. We never had book covers like this in this country. They tend to go for something more symbolic or emblematic. Come on, Socks. The Americans with their science fiction and fantasy are very literal, and I quite like it. I quite like it. They're like computer-generated movies based on the books. Anyway, this is a kind of, now we'd say a kind of Pratchett-esque comedy, except it's, I think, funnier, cleverer, stranger than Pratchett was. Yeah, John DeClay was writing something quite unusual, I think. And I read that in Christmas 1991. It says inside in the tiniest handwriting. Now, this is a book from even earlier. I read this when I was 15, 16. It's Ray Bradbury's The Silver Locusts, also known as The Martian Chronicles. And this copy is so soft and worn down by reading and rereading. End of February 87, it says inside. And it came from Time Slip. Can you see that? Time Slip. It cost 45p. Time Slip was my favourite shop I'd ever seen at that point. It was in Newcastle by the bus station, and it was a science fiction fantasy shop. And we would go there, travelling a long way on the bus, and we'd buy things like David Bowie fanzines. We'd buy Doctor Who fanzines, Star Trek novels, and strange bits of science fiction and horror that you wouldn't see anywhere else. It was a wonderful, dark little cave, spit and sawdust kind of place. And you'd often have signings there. I remember seeing the fellas who created Viz there because they worked around the corner very early on in their career, signing copies of Viz. Speaking of Star Trek books, The Tears of the Singers by Melinda Snodgrass. This is one of my favourite ever Star Trek books, favourite ever science fiction novels. Uhura's right in the heart of this story, and she falls in love with a glam rock keyboardist in the future, and his playing his massive organ on a planet full of endangered seals is what can hold the fabric of the universe together, the harmony that he creates with his massive organ and the seals. The Klingons, of course, are culling the seals. There are pirates culling the seals because when they kill the seals cry crystals, which are very precious and can be collected. I'm probably massively oversimplifying this crazy plot, but it's fantastic. Uhura having this crazy space affair with essentially Rick Wakeman is something to behold. It's really the best of all these Star Trek novels. I think the best novels are in the kind of the 80s, actually, between the movies, because they don't take it all as seriously as the movies do. The best ones are the ones by the women. It's kind of a terrible, sweeping, sexist thing to say, but Diane Duane, A.C. Crispin, Melinda Snodgrass, and many others really make that series for me. And I read them. I've read them all through. Well, going back to the early 80s, I didn't discover this one till 2001 when we found a bookshop in Withington that had a whole room of vintage science fiction, which was magical, and the shop's gone now, long gone. Here's something else I found in Darlington in the early 90s. My favourite Jonathan Carroll book. He's a kind of writer's writer, although I dislike that term. He's a dark fantasist who's written lots of books in a kind of recognisably continuous world. His characters operate in a kind of strange world of his own. This one is about a fan of a kids writer who goes to write the children's author's biography and finds all sorts of strange things going on in this small town in America. All the characters he knows from the books are somehow living there. It's a kind of Dr. Seuss, Edward Gorey, that kind of atmosphere, but with lots of kind of macabre stuff. Talking dogs. And I've read this book, I don't know how many times. 10, I would say. It's a kind of book that I take on holiday. Even made Jeremy read it, and he really doesn't read as much as I do, and he liked it. It's got a kind of slightly dodgy ending. It's a kind of magazine story ending. After this book you've invested your time in, you get this kind of quirky, twisty ending, which is very early 90s in some ways. A sudden sign off from the author. It doesn't ruin it, but who am I to talk? Anyway, it's a great book and I love it. Now, before I finish, here's a set of Armada books in the 70s. Now, these are real finds if you can get your hands on these. They did a series of anthologies, and is it Ronald Chetwynd Hayes edited the Monster Books series. And some of these are just brilliant, and the covers are brilliant, and the people that were chosen to write for them were brilliant as well. It's a nice mix of really vintage, old 19th century, and then people from the 70s when these were compiled. People like Rosemary Timperley, who I will talk about at some point. She's somebody whose stories appear in all kinds of anthologies. And like Mary Danby, she wrote some corkers. Anyway, I'll show you these. It's the first monster book, edited by Ronald Chetwynd Hayes, Armada, 1977, when I was 7. And you'd see these in supermarkets on the revolving carousels of paperbacks, and they cost 40p, so it was just the kind of, with the pocket money books, that's what they were. That's what we're missing these days, I think. I was appalled to find that the new Target Doctor Who books are £10. I don't think that's pocket money books. I think you've got to be, as a kid, you have to be able to go and buy these kinds of things. Unless they've lost the habit, unless those books are just written and produced for middle-aged people who feel nostalgic about buying them when they were kids. It's a shame if that's so. I think that market is surely eternal. There's always going to be committed, obsessive readers in every generation, but the industry needs to find them. It needs to make them by making these kinds of books available. The second monster book, I'm trying to get it in the frame. That one's falling to pieces. The pages are just about falling out. The third Armada monster book was the first one I read, and I remember it being in the shop next to the supermarket, next to this very rough pub in Newton Aycliffe. And Roger Mallison's story, The Gargoyle, about two girls on a school trip to a church, and they bring home this terrible gargoyle with them and have to hide the monster, is a superb story. Roger Mallison wrote in just about all of these volumes under 1 or 2 different pseudonyms, and those stories are the best. Fourth monster book, and the fifth, I think they were kind of annual, and the sixth, the last one. Though, God knows why they don't still do them every year. Richard Davis, earlier perhaps, was it? Yeah, slightly earlier. Sci-Fi 1 from Armada. Sci-Fi 2. There's a huge pair of crepuscular bollocks from space chasing somebody through the woods. Now, if that's not 70s kid science fiction, what isn't? Sci-Fi 3. Again, Richard Davis, who edited lots of anthologies at that time. I think Pamela Cleaver and Catherine Gleason are all the same person. I think it's 2 women, and they're collectively Roger Mallison as well. I think that's what I found out when I did some research last year on this. And SF4. All of these are absolutely brilliant and well worth your time. I have gone over my time again. I don't want to keep you for too long, and I don't want to make this clip impossible to load onto YouTube. It seems to take a while. I'm still getting used to doing all this stuff and using all these things, but I'm enjoying doing these videos, and I'm really heartened by the comments from people who are really engaging with what I'm talking about and the stuff that I love to talk and think about. Anyway, press like and subscribe and spread the word that I'm here chatting about my stuff and my old books. Okay, talk again soon. Bye-bye. I haven't stopped it. I'm stopping it now.